Is the universe fine-tuned? In this recently uploaded video, an atheist claims that it isn't. Of course, the original video is linked in the description below, so you can be certain I'm not taking things out of context. Now with that, let's hear him out.
One of the most common arguments that I frequently hear for the existence of God, or at least an intelligent designer, is the so-called fine-tuning of the universe. And this isn't just from theists. I mean, I even hear actual atheist physicists saying that the universe is fine-tuned, including people like Stephen Hawking, Leonard Susskind, Lee Smolin, physicists that I respect. But quite frankly, this argument just makes zero sense to me. But what exactly is meant by fine-tuning here? Well, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, saying that the universe is fine-tuned for life means that the fact that the universe is able to support life depends delicately on the form of the laws of nature, on the values of some constants of nature, and on aspects of the universe's conditions in its very early stages. But underlining this definition and this line of thinking is the idea that these could be different values. It seems like they think of these fundamental laws and parameters as sort of dials, and there are a range of different possible values that you can dial in for these values. For example, you might have a dial from the values of 0 to 100, and it needs to be precisely tuned just to the value of 50 in order for life to exist. It's very common for somebody making this argument to say something like, well, if the value of the strength of the electromagnetic force was even different by 1 part in a million, then life would not be able to exist. And it just makes zero sense to me because there's zero evidence that any of these things are dials that can assume different values. Like, in order for you to think about these values, these constants of natures, as these dials that need to be finely tuned to certain parameters, you have to assume that it's possible that they could take different values than what is currently observed. And there's just no evidence to support that. And by that I mean that there's never been an observation of any of these laws or constants of nature having different values or having different interactions. It's not like these laws of nature have ever been observed to vary. Like, they're the same everywhere we look. That's why they're laws of nature. That's why they're constants of nature. They don't change. While it's true that in a mathematical formula, you might be able to change a 2 to a 3 and then calculate the repercussions, in reality, we measure 2 every time. And the only place where that 3 value exists is in the imagination of the physicist crunching the calculations. Now, for me to believe that something is real, that something exists, I need either evidence or a good rational reason to accept something's existence. So, for me to accept that the universe is finely tuned, I need either evidence that it is finely tuned, or I need a rational reason to think that it is.
First off, just as a matter of technicality, this isn't actually suggesting that fine-tuning does not exist. It is agreeing that these cosmological constants appear finely tuned. This video doesn't really seem to exactly capture what fine-tuning is, because the term fine-tuning itself does not imply anything more than the mere fact of cosmological constants being in this just right state. But the video also doesn't quite represent the fine-tuning argument properly. There's no assumption in the argument that, in the words of the original video, there's some kind of dial that's being turned to make these constants just right. The only thing the fine-tuning argument assumes is that it is a possibility. Possibility is a default until proven otherwise. And so, my response will be speaking with this clarification in mind for the rest of this video. Now, since there is fine-tuning, the argument is simply exploring the possible reasons why we have fine-tuning, not assuming the possible reasons are true. We're given 3 options for why there is fine-tuning. Option number 1 is these constants necessarily had to be as they are. Option number 2 is that they just happened to be exactly as they needed to be. And option number 3 is that they were intentionally set that way. Now, despite the disconnect on the definition of what fine-tuning is, the video does seem to suggest that they lean toward option number 1. That these constants necessarily are as they are. But the reasoning given for that is because we have no evidence that options number 2 and 3 are possible. So, is he right about that? Well, simply put, since it is conceivable that these constants could have been different, in the absence of actual logical proof that they could not have been different, the mere possibility remains and makes it an option. It's not particularly controversial reasoning that I just gave. Now, it absolutely does not matter that we don't have any examples of other universes where certain constants are different. Should the fact we haven't observed some kind of multiverse stop us from exploring the curiosities of our own world? It's rather backwards thinking to rule out possibilities on the basis that you don't have evidence of them if, as the original video states later, you only have one example and you're not sure why that example is functioning the way it is. Since you don't actually know why this one example is the way that it is, that's when you begin to brainstorm possibilities. And if you don't know why a thing behaves the way it behaves, if you don't actually have your own proven answer, what actually doesn't make sense is to rule out your options as if you know it isn't those. The simple matter remains, you're left with the fact that this universe has constants that are finely tuned. It's just inappropriate to shut down discussion about why we have fine-tuning without giving adequate justification as for why we should shut this down. When you have a fact, you're left to consider possible explanations for that fact. That's how we come to knowledge of truth. Fine-tuning has to be grappled with.
In fact, our sample size for the universe and these constants and laws is 1. I mean, how can you say that something is finely tuned if your sample size is 1?
Because very advanced physicists and mathematicians did the math and found out that if the cosmological constants were different, the universe would not have grown in a way that permits life as we know it. That is, by definition, fine-tuning according to the very definition you read earlier. I have an inkling that due to the disconnect about the definition of fine-tuning, what he's trying to say is that we don't know it could have been any different. But I want to clear this up for any viewers who got lost in translation here.
Now, maybe the multiverse exists. Maybe there's an infinite number of universes that have different permutations of different values for these constants and parameters and laws, and our universe is just one in which these values are permitting of life. But again, there's no evidence for that either. There's no evidence for any other universe other than our own. So if you're just going where the evidence leads, I honestly, genuinely do not understand how anyone can say that the universe is finely tuned. At least, not anything based on evidence.
So let's talk a bit about evidence and what it is in the first place. Evidence is information that we draw conclusions from. So, especially since this video is an admission of fine-tuning, the apparent fine-tuning of these cosmological constants is the piece of evidence we are assessing. And I'll take this opportunity to explain how we even come to discuss the existence of God. The evidence is not so much finding a literal object labeled God. You wouldn't even know if that was God. And this point is especially relevant if God is immaterial, which he most likely would be if we're talking about a God that is not bound by the material world. How we assess the evidence is to look internal to the material universe and give our reasons as to whether this appears to be the product of an intentional mind or not. So, as I've been saying, fine-tuning is the information that we're assessing the best explanations for. That's how we've discovered truth in every discipline ever, forever. Now, when you're looking at a piece of evidence, you don't rule out any possible explanations until you have reason to rule it out. So again, the original video was kind of thinking of this backwards.
And this is especially true when given the history of physics, where we've seen that constants which were previously thought to be fundamental, like Fermi's constant, for example, in the weak decay interactions, this constant was thought to be finely tuned. It was thought that this value was just so to enable these decay patterns that permit the universe that we live in today. However, down the line, we learned about the weak interaction and we understood that actually Fermi's constant was not fundamental, that it actually arises from more fundamental underlying physics which explain why it has the value that it has. Now, if that was true for constants like Fermi's constants, well, we really don't know whether or not the constants today that are considered to be fundamental are truly fundamental, or if there's more underlying deeper layers of physics involved that explain why these forces and constants have the values that they do.
So this example doesn't really refute fine-tuning in the slightest, it just kicks the can back one more step.
Maybe you think that the universe is finely tuned and you think that there's something I'm missing. Please let me know in the comments if there's something that I'm missing here, but I genuinely cannot think of why any rational person would ever say that the universe is finely tuned for life. Especially given the fact that life seems to be so amazingly rare in the universe. At the moment, all we know of is life on Earth. If the universe is finely tuned for life, you'd think that maybe life would be a little bit more common. If anything, the universe seems to be finely tuned for black holes, which are readily abundant at the center of every galaxy. Or maybe it's finely tuned for supernovas, which happen at very commonly regular intervals. It seems incredibly anthropocentric to declare that the universe is finely tuned for life. If anything, life is finely adapted for the universe, and this ordering goes the other way around. That makes way more sense to me than people saying that the universe is finely tuned.
Now this is one of the more interesting ideas brought up in this video, but it doesn't really seem to have much to do with fine-tuning itself. If indeed the Earth is the only planet that contains life, then that raises questions, which again, aren't really directed at fine-tuning. But first things first, what we don't know is whether life is actually scarce in the universe. There's tons of potential reasons we haven't found other life. One is that we just haven't looked enough. Another possibility is that we have interacted with other life in the universe. Maybe the UFO phenomenon is life from other planets, or perhaps if they aren't, we can maybe point to some kind of dark forest theory. There's many possible responses, which makes this very much a premature objection. But let's start with what we do know. We know the Earth is abundant with life of many varieties, and we can say for a fact that the universe is finely tuned so that life on Earth as we know it can flourish. But we also know there are many other Earth-like planets in the universe and within our own galaxy. Now assuming that these Earth-like planets don't contain life, what we absolutely have no clue about is why they don't. Is Earth unique for some reason? Well then that actually raises questions against the atheistic cause from abiogenesis. The absence of life on other planets is not actually an argument against fine-tuning, because it seems entirely plausible that if the Earth is not divinely unique for some reason, life should be able to develop on other planets. And so that brings us to the final point, which is that life on other planets is kind of irrelevant to whether the universe is finely tuned, because the question of abiogenesis has nothing to do with the science of fine-tuning. Fine-tuning is seen in the fact that if the constants are off by just a hair, the development of even matter, or the existence of various elements, and the formation of stars would not be possible. And I'll just let Freeman Dyson explain that.
There's a famous example of a certain energy level in carbon that is a state of the nucleus of the carbon atom, which Fred Hoyle predicted had to exist in order to produce the carbon in stars, although it had never been seen. And it turns out it does exist, as it was verified afterwards. But without that particular level having to be in that particular place, carbon couldn't have been produced in stars and there couldn't be life. So there is a number of details of that sort, which seem to have been sort of fine-tuned to make it possible for creatures like us to evolve and begin asking the questions.
Now with that matter concluded, I do want to say that fine-tuning doesn't necessarily prove God. It leaves us with options, though the other two also have very big implausibilities. But it also needs to be noted that once you begin to explore the various options for why fine-tuning exists, we're beginning to leave the realm of science itself and into the realm of philosophy. Realizing that is absolutely essential for genuine engagement with the topic. So fine-tuning doesn't necessarily prove God, but we can't deny that it exists. Unless you yourself are a brilliant physicist who's drawing different conclusions. But for that I'm completely unqualified, so I definitely won't bother. As we see here, the video I'm responding to isn't actually refuting the existence of fine-tuning. Fine-tuning does have to be contended with if you want to discuss this topic sincerely. But on its own I'd say that while it's intriguing, there's certainly other potential explanations. But if you factor in the existence of beauty and even conscious life itself into the mix of evidence, then I think you begin to see a compelling picture of perhaps the appearance of an intentional mind responsible for the universe. And with that, I'll play a clip of two brilliant young non-theistic YouTubers with philosophy degrees from Princeton and Oxford who are way smarter than me and share my thoughts on the fine-tuning argument. And I'll let that conclude my video.
I mean, this, I have to be honest, like, it does strike me as a potentially plausible line of argument for theism. I mean, I think it's one of the more powerful ones. I articulate some difficulties for fine-tuning arguments. I go through Neil Sinababu's paper, Electrons in Love, where he talks about altering the psychophysical laws, where actually you could have conscious moral creatures in that universe where there are particles just light years apart. God is omnipotent. He can make psychophysical laws different. Psychophysical laws are laws that connect psychological happenings, mental happenings, with physical happenings. And of course, if you're a theist, you already think that there's a non-physical mind, so this is perfectly fine with theism. Anyway, it does pull on me, so I would actually...
Where do you want to put this?
If you're asking me, I say A tier.
I think, I will say that although it doesn't move me because it feels a bit detached, as I say, the reason it doesn't move me, I suspect, is because I don't have a firm grasp of the science. Mm-hmm. But if you asked me to respond to it in a debate, it would probably be the hardest of the arguments.
Yeah.
But maybe that's just because of like my expertise and complete lack of expertise in the area of science. But it seems to be probably the hardest one on the list for me to come up with a convincing response to.
I think that's probably true.
I think it seems to have this effect on all kinds of people, including Christopher Hitchens. And if it upset Christopher Hitchens, then it upsets me.
Exactly.
It's a tricky one.
It's a tricky, and that could, I mean, some of the responses could put it down to B, but
and again,
I think A is, I think it's fine.
It depends on the purpose of the argument, because if it's supposed to convince, then for me, it just doesn't really do anything for me, and so I'd put it way down low. But as an argument in terms of what to have in your list if you're trying to establish the existence of God for somebody, it seems to be a powerful one. So I mean, yeah, you can respond to fine-tuning arguments by talking about atoms light years apart having relationships with each other.
And remember, I mean, we're talking about under theism there.
It just seems a bit less plausible.
I mean, it tells us something's, I don't know, something's up, something's going on, something strange about our universe, maybe.
Something about the universe is in a way that it could very easily have not been.
At least epistemically.
That seems difficult to explain.
Yeah.
Then, okay, sure, you know what? Fine.
A tier
we'll shake on it. A tier.
A tier it is.
If nothing else, you can at least appreciate the mysterious universe we live in, that you're able to live in and experience very impressive things in. And with that, thanks for watching.